In the autumn of the year Merritt Dane turned 31. He built a house on 320 acres of border grassland that he had filed on with the territorial authority 2 years prior. He built it himself, with help from his neighbor Farley Briggs, for the roof beams, and he built it well. 4 rooms, a stone fireplace, 2 windows on the south side to catch the winter light, and a front porch long enough for 2 people to sit and watch the grass run all the way to the horizon. He built 2 stools. He put them both on the porch before the house was finished. One was a normal stool, human proportioned, made from ash, sanded smooth, sturdy enough for a man his size. The second was different. It was wider by 6 inches, deeper by 3, and built from heavier timber, oak instead of ash, joined with iron brackets instead of wooden pegs. The legs were thicker. The seat was reinforced. It was, by any reasonable measurement, a stool designed for someone considerably larger than Merritt Dane. His neighbor Farley came to help with the roof beams and saw the 2 stools sitting on a porch that had no roof yet, looking out at the border grass. "Merritt," Farley said, "you don't have a wife." "Not yet," said Merritt. Farley pointed at the second stool. "That one's bigger." "Who's it for?" "Don't know yet," Merritt said. "But she'll be big, and she'll need a stool that holds her without creaking." Farley looked at him for a moment, trying to decide whether this was a joke. It was not. Merritt Dane did not make jokes about furniture. He did not make jokes about much of anything. He was the kind of man who decided what he was building before he started building it, and who considered the decision more important than the construction. "You're pretty sure about this," Farley said. "I'm sure about the stools," Merritt said. "The rest will follow." This was the kind of man Merritt Dane was: practical, forward-thinking, possessed of a certainty about the shape of his future life that other people sometimes found strange, and that he simply found clarifying. He had homesteaded his 320 acres with a clear vision. He would farm wheat, a hardy variety that a trading family from the eastern mountains had brought, and that some of the older farmers swore would survive the border winters. He would raise some cattle. He would build something lasting on this ground, and he would not do it alone. He had seen what loneliness did to men on the frontier. He had watched it in his own father, who had pioneered into the Midlands in the previous generation and spent 20 years building something admirable and largely empty. Edmund Dane had died at his kitchen table, with a full barn and a full cellar and an empty chair across from him. Merritt intended to build something that was full. He placed his listing in the Border Bride Registry in November. The registry was not a romantic institution. It was a practical one, a territorial service that matched settlers in the border regions with prospective spouses from across the territories. Human men and orc women. Orc men and human women. The border was the place where species mixed, where the old prohibitions had softened into guidelines, and the guidelines had softened into custom. Mixed marriages were not common, but they were not uncommon either. The registry simply organized what was already happening. Merritt had thought carefully about what to write. He listed his qualities plainly: 31, landowner, or would be when his 5-year claim matured, healthy, literate, and possessed of what he considered a reasonable temperament, meaning he did not drink, did not quarrel without cause, and kept his word. He added one sentence at the end that was not practical at all. 2 stools on the porch. One is wider than the other because I built it for someone I haven't met yet. I would very much like someone to understand why. That sentence produced 43 responses. If that last line stopped you, if you read it twice the way 43 women read it, then you know what kind of story this is. Hit subscribe, leave a like. Tell us in the comments, would you have written back? Because one woman did, and her letter changed everything. Among the 43 women who wrote to Merritt Dane was one named Tindra. She was 26 years old, orc, the daughter of a foundry master in a settlement 3 territories east. She had worked in her father's casting shop since she was 12, not as an assistant, but as a caster. She ran the crucibles. She mixed the alloys. She prepared the molds with the obsessive precision of a person who understood that a fraction of a degree in temperature or a grain of impurity in the metal was the difference between a casting that held and a casting that cracked. It was a profession considered unusual for an orc woman. Foundry work in the eastern settlements was traditionally male, heavy, hot, and conducted in a culture that associated metal with masculinity. Tindra had ignored this association the way she ignored most things that did not correspond to observable reality. She was good at casting the metal, did not care who poured it. She had been reading registry listings for 6 months with a researcher's detachment, evaluating the advertisements the way she evaluated castings, looking for the one that was genuinely, precisely what it claimed to be. Most failed this test immediately. The language was wrong, too eager, too performative. Too much effort spent describing what the writer wanted, and not enough describing what the writer was. Then she read Merritt Dane's listing and came to the last sentence. 2 stools on the porch. One is wider than the other because I built it for someone I haven't met yet. I would very much like someone to understand why. She read this sentence 3 times. Then she took out a sheet of paper and wrote the most direct, unflattering, honest letter she had ever written. She described herself as a caster, which she knew many men, human and orc alike, would find off-putting. She described her father's shop, her lack of domestic skills beyond organization, and her conviction that the border was a place where a person might be allowed to be exactly what they were, without a settlement's opinion of what that should look like. Then she wrote the paragraph that would make Merritt Dane close the other 42 letters and never open them again. In casting, the most important thing is not the eye. It is the ear. I have learned to hear the metal, the sound it makes when it flows into the mold correctly, the sound it makes when it cools at the right rate, the sound it makes when it contracts around the form. A flawed casting sounds different from a good one, a crack instead of a click, a groan instead of a settling. I have worked with my ears for 14 years. I can tell you whether a piece is sound before it comes out of the mold, just by listening. I tell you this because I believe a house should sound right too. The creak of a beam that is properly settled. The silence of a wall that does not let wind through. The particular, she crossed out that phrase and wrote instead, the specific sound of a door that closes cleanly on its hinges. I have never heard a house that was built for 2 people, but I believe I would recognize it if I did. She did not mention the stool directly, but she thought about it for a long time after she sealed the letter. Merritt Dane read Tindra's letter with the attention he gave to everything important. He read it twice, which was his standard for documents he considered worth his time. He noticed that she had not described her appearance, which he found refreshing. He noticed that she had described her senses, specifically her hearing, which he found remarkable. And he noticed the phrase allowed to be exactly what they were, which matched something he had been trying to put into words about why he had come to the border. He wrote back that day. He told her about the wheat, the experimental variety he was trying, a hardy strain that the Eastern traders had brought. He told her that he thought craft was probably the most honest form of communication, that a person revealed themselves more truly in what they built than in what they said, which was not a typical thing for a border farmer to write, but he had been thinking about it since reading her description of hearing the metal cool. He told her about the 2 stools. I built them before I built the house proper, he wrote. I am aware that this is a strange order of operations, but I have found that if you know what you are building toward, the practical steps tend to arrange themselves. The stool was the point. The house is infrastructure. Tindra read that letter in her father's casting shop after the last pour of the day, when the crucibles were cooling and the air smelled of quenched metal and stone dust. She read it in the focused way she read things that were worth reading, completely, without distraction, going back for individual sentences. The stool was the point. The house is infrastructure. She set the letter down on the workbench. This is a person who thinks, she thought. This is a person who knows the difference between the point and the infrastructure. She was careful with herself here, careful not to want it too quickly. This is possibly the person they wrote to each other for 5 months. Their letters grew longer as the correspondence progressed, until by the 3rd month they were writing what amounted to essays on craft, on the border, on what it meant to build a life deliberately versus having one happen to you, on the specific quality of different materials, and why some things lasted and others didn't. On dogs, he had a cattle dog named Ptolemy, because the animal had, Merritt said, a geocentric view of the universe, meaning he believed everything revolved around him and was usually correct about it. on the specific pleasure of working with your hands and your senses, and on why honesty was, both of them agreed, the only interesting policy in any relationship. His letters smelled of wheat straw and open air. Hers smelled of quenched metal and stone. Both of them noticed. Neither of them mentioned it for 4 months. Then Merritt wrote, "I have started looking forward to the smell of your letters before I read them. I realize this is unusual information to share." And Tindra wrote back, "Your letters smell like a place I have never been. I find that I want to go there." In the 4th month, Tindra's father had an accident. A crucible cracked during a high-temperature pour, and the molten metal splashed across his arms. The burns were severe. He survived, but his ability to work the forge, the precise, demanding physical labor of foundry operation, was gone. Tindra was the only person who could run the shop. She knew the work better than anyone. She had, without discussion, become the operation's actual master caster. She wrote to Merritt about this honestly. "I cannot, in good conscience, leave my father without the means to run his business when he is still recovering. I do not know when this will change. I wanted to tell you immediately because you told me in your second letter that you intended to always be told things immediately. And I find that I have adopted this preference as well." Merritt's response arrived 7 days later. "I understand. I will wait. The second stool is not going anywhere. I put good wood in it." A pause in the letter, evidenced by a slight change in the angle of the writing, as if he had set the pen down and picked it up again. "I want to say something that I hope is not forward. I believe, based on 5 months of letters that have been more honest than most conversations I have had in person, that you are the person I built the stool for. I am not certain of this. I have never met you, but I am certain enough to wait, and I am not in the habit of being certain about things I am not reasonably sure of." Tindra read this letter at the casting bench, with stone dust on her arms and the smell of cooled metal around her. She recognized what was happening inside her, a response that was serious, inconvenient, and not reversible. She waited 8 more months. Her father recovered enough by the following autumn to take on a young apprentice, a boy Tindra had been training since the spring, quietly, with this specific moment in mind. On the day the apprentice completed his first solo pour without a single flaw, Tindra walked home, wrote a letter to Merritt Dane, and told him she was ready. She arrived in early November, 2 years after his listing had appeared in the registry. But she almost did not arrive at all. The border road between the eastern settlements and the grasslands was 3 weeks of travel by wagon, longer if the weather turned, which it did in the second week. Tindra had hired passage with a merchant convoy heading west, paying her fare with the last of the savings she had set aside during the months of preparation. Her trunk sat in the back of the merchant's wagon, a heavy wooden box containing everything she owned. The letters, every one of Merritt's letters, bundled in order, tied with a leather cord. 5 months of correspondence that she had read so many times the paper was soft at the folds. Her father's casting tools, the precision instruments he had given her as a parting gift, calipers, a temperature gauge, a set of mold finishing files that had belonged to his father before him, 3 generations of foundry work, packed in oiled cloth, and a small leather case containing her own tools, the one she had made herself over 14 years, shaped to her grip, calibrated to her methods. A caster's tools were personal. They were extensions of the body. Losing them was like losing fingers. The bandits hit the convoy on the 14th day, in a stretch of road between 2 settlements, where the grassland was flat, and the nearest help was a 4-hour ride in either direction. There were 5 of them. They came from the tree line at dawn, mounted, armed, fast. The merchant convoy had no guards. The 3 wagon drivers surrendered immediately. Tindra, riding in the back of the second wagon, heard the shout and the sound of horses, and was on her feet before she understood what was happening. They took everything: the merchant's cargo, the driver's coin purses, and Tindra's trunk. She fought for it. She was orc, stronger than the men who grabbed the trunk, strong enough to hold one end while 2 of them pulled the other. But the 3rd man put a blade against the wagon's lead horse and told her that if she didn't let go, the horse would bleed out in the road and the convoy would be stranded. She let go. They rode away with her letters, her father's tools, and 14 years of her own work packed in oiled cloth and leather. They took everything except what she was wearing and what she carried in her head. The convoy limped to the next settlement. The merchants filed a report with the territorial authority. Tindra sat on the edge of the wagon and looked at her empty hands and thought about the man 3 days west who was waiting for her with 2 stools on a porch. She had 2 choices. She could wait for the territorial authority to investigate, which could take weeks, and which might recover nothing. Or she could walk. She walked 3 days on foot across the border grassland, carrying nothing except the clothes on her back and the memory of every letter she had received, which she had read often enough to recite from beginning to end. She arrived at the crossroads where Merritt had told her he would be waiting on the morning of the 17th day. If you're watching a woman walk 3 days across open grassland with nothing, no tools, no letters, no trunk, just the decision to arrive, then you're watching the part of the story where everything gets decided. Subscribe, like, tell us, would you have walked? The border sky in November was a shade of blue that Tindra had never seen in a foundry, so clear and so deep that it almost vibrated, as if the color itself was under tension. The grass was the color of old bronze, not gold, she corrected herself, bronze because she thought in metals, and the air carried a smell she could not identify. Cold, clean, vegetal, with a mineral edge underneath. She would later learn that this was simply the smell of the plains, which had no equivalent and no substitute. Merritt was at the crossroads. He was standing beside a wagon, a plain, well-maintained farm wagon with a single horse. He was taller than she had imagined from his letters, with the kind of stillness she recognized from his writing. The quietness of a person who used words carefully because they understood what words were for. He looked at her, she looked at him. The distance between them, 30 feet of dirt road, 2 years of letters, 3 territories of geography, felt simultaneously enormous and irrelevant. Merritt did not look at her face first. She noticed this because she had been expecting it, the visual inventory that human men performed when encountering an orc woman for the first time. The assessment of size, of skin color, of the features that marked her as other. He looked at her, not at any specific part of her, at her, the whole of her standing on the road with no trunk and no tools and no possessions, wearing travel-worn clothes and the expression of a person who had walked 3 days to get here and would walk 3 more if necessary. "Miss Tindra," he said. "Mr. Dane." His voice was lower than she had imagined from the letters, a plain, unhurried baritone that matched the handwriting. The sound of a man who did not rush because rushing implied uncertainty, and he was not uncertain. She listened to his voice the way she listened to metal, the resonance, the steadiness, the absence of cracks. "I understand there's a stool," she said. He drove her to the farm in the wagon. The road was packed dirt. The horse was calm, and the landscape opened around them as they left the crossroads, grassland in every direction, the horizon so far away it seemed theoretical. Tindra sat on the wagon bench and felt the scale of the place enter her through her ears. The sound of the plains was different from anything she had known. The foundry was enclosed. Every sound bounced off walls and ceiling, creating layers of echo that she had spent 14 years learning to read. The plains were open. Sound traveled outward without returning. The wind moved through the grass with a continuous low whisper that had no walls to interrupt it. It was, she realized, the acoustic opposite of everything she knew, and instead of finding it disorienting, she found it clarifying the way a clean mold was clarifying after hours of working with used ones. The house was exactly as he had described it in the letters. 4 rooms, south-facing windows, the stone fireplace, and on the porch, exactly where he had put them, the 2 stools. She saw the wide one immediately. She walked to it. She did not sit down right away. She ran a hand along the seat, testing the join, checking the wood grain, evaluating the construction with the automatic precision of a person who had spent her life assessing whether things were built to last. "Good join," she said. Oak frame, ash seat, iron brackets at the legs." She turned the stool over and looked at the underside. The brackets were hand-forged, rough, not professionally finished, but structurally sound. Farmer's metalwork, not a caster's, but honest. "You forge your own hardware?" "When I have to. I'm not good at it. The brackets are oversized. You used more metal than necessary." I wanted them to hold. She set the stool back on its legs. She looked at it for one more second. Then she sat in it. It held. It did not creak. It did not shift. The width was right. Her hips sat squarely on the seat without overhang. The depth was right. Her back rested against the rail without strain. The height was right. Her feet were flat on the porch boards. He had never met an orc woman. He had estimated the dimensions from the registry standard size charts and added 2 inches in every direction. Because, he had written in one of his letters, he would rather build too large and be wrong than build too small and be insulting. He had not been wrong. Tindra sat in the stool and looked at the grass going on until it met the sky. And she thought, this is the point. Everything else is infrastructure. Well, she said, Ptolemy, the cattle dog who had a geocentric view of the universe, came around the corner of the house to investigate. He approached Tindra with the focused attention of a scientist evaluating data, circling once, sniffing twice, and then sitting down beside her stool and placing his head on her knee. Merritt looked at the dog. The dog looked at Tindra. Tindra looked at the grass. That's the most conclusive endorsement he's ever given anyone, Merritt said. He has good judgment, Tindra said. She was already home. She knew it the way she knew a sound cast from a flawed one, not through analysis, but through recognition. The immediate, bone-level certainty that what she was hearing was right. They were married on the 3rd of December by the county judge in the front room of the house. There was no ceremony to speak of. Both of them preferred it that way. The judge said the words. They said the words back. Farley Briggs served as witness, standing by the fireplace with his hat in his hands and an expression that suggested he still wasn't entirely sure this was real. Merritt put a ring on Tindra's finger. She looked at it. It was not a professional piece. It was not smooth, not polished, not even perfectly round. It was iron, rough cast, with visible seam lines where the mold had not been properly finished. On the outer surface, scratched into the metal with what appeared to be a nail, was a small pattern, a wheat sheaf. Tindra held her hand up and examined the ring with the eye of a master caster. The iron was decent quality. The casting was not. The mold had been homemade, probably carved from a block of sandstone based on the grain pattern on the surface. The pour had been uneven. The cooling had been too fast, leaving stress marks in the metal. It was, by professional standards, a deeply flawed piece of work. You made this, she said. I made it. You cast it yourself. I tried. The mold cracked on the first attempt. The second attempt cooled too fast. The third one held, mostly. You cast a ring. I wanted to make it in your language, Merritt said. I'm not a caster, but you told me that craft was the most honest form of communication. So I made it instead of buying it. Tindra looked at the ring on her finger, the scratched wheat sheaf, the uneven surface, the stress marks that told her exactly how hot the iron had been and how fast it had cooled, and how many times the man who poured it had failed before he succeeded. She could have made a perfect ring in 20 minutes. She could fix this one in 10, smooth the seam, polish the surface, recut the wheat pattern with proper tools. She did not fix it. She wore it as it was. That night, their first night in the house as husband and wife, Tindra lay in the dark and listened, not to Merritt, who was asleep in the next room. They had agreed without discussion to give each other space, the practical arrangement of two people who had known each other through letters and were now learning each other through proximity. The sleeping quarters were separate. The respect was mutual. The patience was shared. She listened to the house. It was a habit from the foundry, the end-of-day audit that every caster performed, listening to the cooling shop for the sounds that indicated whether the day's work was sound. Tindra had spent 14 years mapping enclosed spaces by their acoustics, and she did it now automatically, lying in the dark, cataloging every sound the house made. The wind entered through a gap in the south-facing window frame, a thin, high whistle that indicated the seal was incomplete. The third roof beam from the east wall produced a low creak every time the wind gusted, a rhythmic, predictable stress sound that meant the beam was carrying more load than it was designed for, probably due to settling in the foundation. The chimney drew unevenly. She could hear the draft pulling left instead of center, which meant the flue was partially obstructed, probably by a bird's nest or accumulated soot. 3 sounds: 3 structural issues, identified in one night by ear alone, without moving from her bed. In the morning, she found Merritt at the south fence, checking the posts. 3 things, she said. He looked at her. The south window seal is incomplete. Wind is entering through the bottom left corner. The third roof beam from the east wall is overloaded and needs a support bracket. And your chimney draws left because the flue is partially blocked. Merritt looked at her for a long moment. You heard all of that? I heard all of that from inside the house. From inside the house, he looked at the south window, which was 15 feet away. He could see nothing wrong with it from where he stood. But he had noticed, now that she mentioned it, that the room was colder than it should have been on the south side, and he had assumed it was the wall construction rather than the window. I'll fix the window today, he said. I'll fix the beam, she said. It needs an iron bracket. I'll need your forge. The forge is behind the barn. It's not much. It's enough. She walked toward the barn. Ptolemy followed her. Merritt watched them go, the orc woman and the dog, heading toward a forge that was about to produce better metalwork than it had ever produced in its life. He stood at the fence for another moment. He was thinking about a letter he had received 5 months ago, in which a woman he had never met had written, I believe a house should sound right. And he was thinking about how she had been here for one night and had already heard 3 things he had missed in 2 years. He went to fix the window. Tindra settled into the farm the way metal settled into a mold, completely, finding every channel and filling it. She brought her caster's precision to everything she touched. The farm's metal infrastructure, hinges, brackets, tool fittings, the iron hardware that held the physical world of the property together, had been maintained by Merritt with the competent but unspecialized attention of a farmer who fixed things when they broke. Tindra did not fix things when they broke. She replaced them before they could break, examining every metal component on the property with a professional's diagnostic instinct, and marking the ones that would fail within the season. Within 3 months, every hinge on the property swung without resistance, every bracket held without strain, every tool fitting was tight, every bolt properly gauged, every piece of metal hardware on the Dane farm performing at a level that Merritt had not known was possible. I didn't realize the gate was dragging, he told her, one evening after she had recast the gate's pivot pin and rehung it in an afternoon. It wasn't dragging, Tindra said. It was compensating. The pin was wearing unevenly, which meant the gate was shifting a fraction of an inch every time it swung. In 6 months, the post would have cracked. You heard this? I heard the gate closing yesterday. The sound was wrong, a scrape instead of a click. A click means it's off axis. Merritt looked at the gate. It closed silently now, the weight transferring cleanly through the new pin into the post. He had walked through that gate 1,000 times and had never noticed the scrape. Tindra had heard it once and had identified the problem, the cause, the timeline, and the solution. He was beginning to understand that living with this woman was going to be an ongoing education in how much of the world he had been missing. Within a year, a small foundry had appeared in the space behind the barn. Tindra had not asked permission to build it, and Merritt had not thought to offer. She had simply assessed the available space, selected a location that was downwind from the house and upwind from the livestock, important for a forge that produced smoke and sparks, and constructed a working foundry from salvaged materials and the forge that Merritt had been using to make rough hardware. The forge was transformed. What had been a basic fire pit with a hand bellows became a proper casting station. A lined crucible, a temperature-controlled burn chamber, a sand casting bed for small pieces, and a ventilation system that Tindra had designed using the natural air currents of the property. Currents she had mapped by standing in various locations and listening to the wind. Neighbors noticed the border settlements were chronically underserved by skilled metal workers. The nearest professional forge was a 2-day ride east. Broken tools, failed hinges, cracked plow blades, these were the constant grinding infrastructure problems of frontier farming, and most settlers either lived with them or made rough repairs that lasted a season before failing again. Tindra began taking repair work, not as a business at first, as a favor. Farley Briggs brought a cracked axle bracket that had been held together with wire for 2 years. Tindra recast it in an afternoon. A settler from the North Road brought a set of plow blades that had been resharpened so many times they were thin as paper. Tindra cast new ones from scrap iron that the settler had been stockpiling without knowing what to do with. Word spread. By the second year, Tindra had a regular schedule of repair work from farms across the area. She did not advertise. She did not need to. The quality of her castings was its own advertisement. Pieces that held through seasons of hard use, that did not crack or warp or fail at the stress points the way commercially produced hardware did. She was, without having sought the title, the most reliable metalworker in the border region. An Orc woman, running a foundry behind a wheat farm, producing work that professional forges in the eastern settlements would have been proud to claim. If you're watching an Orc woman build a foundry behind a barn and wondering what this has to do with a love story, it has everything to do with it. Because what Merritt and Tindra were building wasn't a romance. It was a partnership. And partnerships are built the way stools are built. One joint at a time, tested under weight, designed to hold. Subscribe, like, tell us, what's the best partnership you've ever been part of? The boundary stones were discovered in the spring of the second year. Tindra needed to expand the foundry's fuel storage. She was burning through charcoal faster than the local supplier could deliver, and she wanted to build a covered storage shed with capacity for a full season's supply. The logical location was the southwest corner of the property, where the ground was level and the drainage was good. She paced out the dimensions of the proposed shed. Then, because she was a person who measured things, she paced out the distance from the shed's planned location to the nearest property boundary. She stopped. The boundary stone, a heavy granite marker engraved with the territorial survey number, was not where the property map said it should be. According to the map that hung in Merritt's study, the southwest boundary of the Dane property extended to a line of cottonwood trees that ran along a seasonal creek. The boundary stone should have been at the base of the third cottonwood. The survey record was specific. The stone was 40 yards east of the third cottonwood. Tindra walked the full boundary line that afternoon. She found 3 more stones that had been moved, all in the same direction, all shifting the property line inward, all reducing the Dane farm's footprint by approximately the same distance. 20 acres. Someone had moved the boundary stones and stolen 20 acres of Merritt's land. She brought it to Merritt that evening with the property map, her own measurements, and a diagram she had drawn showing the original boundary positions and the current ones. The map says 320, she said. The ground says 300. Merritt studied the diagram. He studied it for a long time. How long has this been like this, he asked. I don't know. The stones are settled. They've been in their current positions for at least a season, based on the soil compaction around the bases, possibly longer. Merritt looked at the southwest boundary. Beyond his fence line, beyond where his fence line should have been, the land extended to the Cottonwood Creek. On that land, clearly visible, were the marks of recent plowing. Someone had been working his ground. Garrett, Merritt said, the neighbor to the south? He wanted to buy those 20 acres 2 years ago. I said no. He asked twice more after that. I said no both times. Merritt rode to Garrett's farm the next morning. Tindra did not go with him. This was his land, his boundary, his confrontation. She understood the distinction. He was gone for 2 hours. When he returned, his expression was the same as when he had left. Controlled, unhurried, revealing nothing. But the set of his jaw was different. He moved them, Merritt said. He admitted it when I showed him the survey numbers. He tried to say it was a mistake, that he'd been plowing close to the line and might have displaced the stones accidentally. Then I told him I had a caster on my property who had measured every inch of the boundary to the fraction, and that her measurements matched the original survey to the digit, and that the territorial office would be very interested in a formal complaint. What did he say? He said he'd move them back by Friday. And he did. Tindra looked at him. You didn't mention that I'm Orc. It wasn't relevant. He's going to find out eventually. He already knows. Everyone in the settlement knows. But what he heard today was not an Orc woman measured your boundary. What he heard was a person who measures in fractions caught you stealing 20 acres. The precision is what mattered, not the species. Tindra absorbed this. It was, she decided, the most respectful thing Merritt had ever said to her. Not because it was kind, but because it was accurate. The incident with the casting happened on a Thursday night in the 3rd year. Tindra was in the house. The evening was quiet. The kind of settled, windless border night when the grass stopped moving and the sky was so still that the stars looked like they had been hammered into the dark. She heard the sound at 20 minutes past the 10th bell. Not a normal sound, not the wind, not an animal, not any of the house's cataloged noises that she had memorized in 3 years of listening. This was a sharp, percussive crack followed by a hissing sibilance, the unmistakable acoustic signature of a mold failure during a hot pour. She was out of the house and running toward the foundry before the echo faded. The forge was lit. The crucible was hot. The air smelled of burned sand and overheated iron. And Merritt was standing in the middle of it, covered in soot from his eyebrows to his boots, holding a cracked mold in both hands and staring at the mess on the casting bed, with an expression that combined embarrassment, frustration, and the specific guilt of a person who had been caught doing something they had intended to do in secret. "What happened?" Tindra said. Merritt set the cracked mold down. He looked at her, soot on his face, iron splatter on his boots, the remains of a catastrophically failed casting cooling on the sandbed, a shapeless blob of metal that bore no resemblance to whatever it had been intended to be. "I was trying to cast something," he said. "I can see that." "What?" He reached into his pocket and produced a small piece of paper, a drawing, rough, practical, clearly not the work of an artist, but the work of a man who understood engineering. It showed a simple bracket design, an L-shaped piece with mounting holes, the kind of thing that any competent caster could produce in 10 minutes. Tindra looked at the drawing. She looked at the destroyed casting on the sand bed. She looked at Merritt. "You've been coming out here at night," she said. It was not a question. She had heard sounds from the foundry area on 3 previous nights and had attributed them to the cooling forge. She now understood that the sounds had not been the forge cooling. They had been her husband, failing. "Why didn't you tell me?" Merritt wiped a streak of soot from his jaw. He did not look at her when he answered. "Because I wanted to learn it myself first. I wanted to. I know your craft is yours. I know you've spent 14 years becoming what you are, but we live in the same house and work the same land, and I wanted to understand what you do, not just watch it, understand it." He paused. "I wanted to learn your language, the way you learned mine when you figured out the wheat rotation and the cattle schedules and the planting calendar. You learned everything about what I do, and I've been standing next to your foundry for 3 years without understanding the first thing about how metal moves." Tindra looked at the ruined casting, the cracked mold, the overheated crucible, the evidence of a man who had been spending his nights secretly trying to teach himself a skill that took 14 years to master, and who had been failing spectacularly and silently because he was too proud, or too respectful, to ask for help. "You overheated the crucible," she said. "The iron was too hot when you poured. That's why the mold cracked. Thermal shock. And the sand was too wet. You can hear it if you listen. Wet sand hisses before the pour. Dry sand clicks. I couldn't tell the difference. You will. After I teach you." He looked at her. "Come here," she said. "I'll show you how to prepare the sand. We'll start with that." She showed him that night. In the foundry behind the barn, she taught him how to pack a casting bed, how to test the sand for moisture by pressing it and listening. The specific, subtle difference between the sound of dry sand compressing and wet sand compressing. How to gauge the temperature of the crucible by the color of the glow and the pitch of the hum the metal produced as it heated. He was clumsy. His technique was wrong. His instincts were agricultural. He treated metal like soil, with force and patience, and it required instead precision and timing. But he listened. He listened with the focus of a man who understood that what he was learning was not a skill, but a bridge, a way of crossing the distance between what he knew and what she knew, between his language and hers. By the second hour, he had successfully packed a mold and poured a bracket that, while not beautiful, was structurally sound. Tindra inspected it with her professional eye and declared it adequate with potential. "Adequate with potential," Merritt repeated. "Is that good?" "Coming from me, it's very good." They stood in the foundry together. The forge was cooling, ticking, settling, making the sounds that metal made when it was done working and was ready to rest. Merritt looked at the bracket he had cast. Tindra looked at the man who had cast it. Neither of them said what the moment contained. But the moment contained it anyway. The wheat succeeded. In the hard years of the middle decade, when other border farms failed, when the drought came and the rain stopped and the grass turned from bronze to gray and the cattle starved on pasture that had nothing left to give, the Dane farm held. It held because of the diversification that Merritt had planned and that Tindra had amplified. Wheat from the hardy eastern variety that survived drought better than any local strain. Cattle managed on a rotation system that Merritt had developed over 5 years of careful observation. And the foundry, Tindra's foundry, which by the 5th year was producing enough income from repair work and custom casting to cover the shortfall when the wheat came up short. 3 revenue sources. 3 ways of surviving when any single one would have failed alone. The farming equivalent of the iron brackets Tindra put on her furniture, redundant, oversized, designed for the stress that would come rather than the stress that existed. They were not wealthy, but they were solvent, and they were, in the specific way that mattered, full. They had 3 children. The first was born in the 3rd year, a boy half human and half orc, with his father's quiet focus and his mother's ability to hear things that other people missed. The second came 2 years later, a girl with her mother's build and her father's stubbornness, who at the age of 4 declared that she would be a farmer and a caster, and who held to this declaration with an intensity that neither parent attempted to discourage. The third arrived in the 7th year, another boy, smaller, gentler, who preferred drawing to either farming or metalwork, and who was allowed, without comment, to be exactly what he was. Each of them grew up in a house where craft was treated as a form of truth-telling, where the difference between doing something adequately and doing something well was considered the most important distinction a person could learn, and where both parents sat together on the porch when the work was done. In the 2 stools that had been built before the house was, and watched the grass run all the way to the horizon. The children understood the stools, not because their parents explained them, they never did, but because the stools were always there, on the porch, one human-sized and one orc-sized, occupied every evening by 2 people who had found each other through letters and built a life through labor, and who sat in them every night, not because it was ritual, but because it was the point. The house was infrastructure. The stools were the point. The foundry grew. By the 10th year it had a name, Dane Foundry, and a reputation that extended beyond the immediate settlement. Settlers from 3 territories brought work. Tindra trained 2 apprentices, orc and human, and managed the operation with the same organized precision she had brought to everything since the day she arrived, with empty hands, and identified 3 structural problems by ear before breakfast. Merritt ran the farm, the wheat, the cattle, the land that he had filed on 15 years ago with a vision that had been strange and had turned out to be exactly right. He worked it with the steady, unhurried discipline that defined everything he did, and he watched over the years as the property he had built alone became the property they had built together, and the difference was visible in every fence post and roof beam and iron bracket on the place. Neighbors who had questioned the arrangement, an orc woman on a human farm, a mixed marriage on the border, had stopped questioning it by the 5th year, not because they had changed their minds about the propriety of it, but because the evidence was irrefutable. The Dane farm was the most productive operation in the district. The Dane foundry was the most reliable metalwork in 3 territories, and the Dane family, human, orc, and the 3 children who were both, was the most stable household on the border road. Evidence, Merritt had always believed, was more persuasive than argument. The conversation about the ring happened on an evening in the 23rd year of their marriage. They were on the porch. The stools were worn now. 23 years of weather and use had softened the wood and darkened the iron brackets, but they held. The oak frame of the wide stool had not cracked. The ash seat of the narrow one had not split. 23 years of sitting and the stools were sound. Merritt looked at Tindra's hand resting on the arm of her stool. The ring was still on her finger, the rough cast iron band he had made in his forge before their wedding. 23 years of wear had polished the high points and left the low ones dark, creating a pattern of light and shadow on the metal surface that was not intentional, but that had become, over time, beautiful in its own accidental way. The wheat sheaf scratched into the surface was still visible, though worn. The seam lines were still present. The stress marks from the too fast cooling were still readable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Tindra knew what she was looking at. She had always known. She was a master caster who had produced thousands of flawless pieces in her career, and she wore on her finger a piece of iron that would have failed her quality inspection on the day it was made. "Can I ask you something?" Merritt said. "You're going to anyway. The ring." Tindra looked at her hand. "You could have fixed it," Merritt said, "any time in the last 23 years. You could have recast it in your foundry in 10 minutes and produced something perfect. You could have smoothed the seam, polished the surface, recut the wheat pattern with proper tools. You're the best caster in 3 territories. This ring is, by your standards, a deeply flawed piece of work." He looked at her. "Why didn't you fix it?" Tindra was quiet for a moment. She turned the ring on her finger, slowly, feeling the uneven surface pass under her thumb. The seam lines, the stress marks, the scratched wheat sheaf that a farmer had carved with a nail because he did not have proper engraving tools. "Because you made it," she said. Merritt waited. "You're not a caster, Merritt. You've never been a caster. The ring you made is uneven, overworked, and cooled wrong. The mold was amateur. The pour was unsteady. Every flaw in this ring tells me exactly how hard you tried, and exactly how much you didn't know, and exactly how much you wanted to get it right anyway." She held up her hand. The ring caught the last light. "A perfect ring would tell me that someone with skill made a thing. This ring tells me that someone without skill made a thing anyway, because the making was more important than the result, because he wanted to speak my language, even though he didn't know it yet." She looked at him. "The flaw is the most valuable part. I will never fix it." Merritt looked at the ring on her finger. The rough, imperfect, 23-year-old piece of iron that he had cast in a farmer's forge with no training and no talent, and nothing but the conviction that a ring made by his own hands would mean more than a ring made by anyone else's. He had been right about that. The way he had been right about the stools. If that ring just hits you somewhere you weren't ready for, if you understand that the most valuable things are the ones somebody made badly but honestly, then you know why this story exists. Subscribe. Like, tell us in the comments, what's your version of the ring? What flawed thing do you keep because of who made it? Years passed. The way years pass on a working farm, measured not in calendars but in seasons, in harvests, in the slow accumulation of evidence that a life was being lived well. The wheat grew, the cattle multiplied, the foundry produced. The children grew up and scattered the way children did. The eldest to a neighboring territory where he started his own farm. The daughter to the eastern settlements where she opened a foundry that bore the Dane name. The youngest to a city where he drew buildings and bridges and wrote letters home that were longer than anyone expected and more beautifully written than anyone had taught him to be. Farley Briggs died in the 16th year, leaving behind a farm that his son took over, and a story about 2 stools on a porch with no roof that he had told so many times at the settlement store that it had become local legend. People who had never met Merritt Dane knew the story of the stools. People who had never met Tindra knew that one was wider than the other, and why. Ptolemy the dog, who had maintained his geocentric worldview to the end, died in the 14th year, and was buried under the cottonwood tree at the southwest corner of the property, the same corner where the boundary stones had been moved, and where Tindra had discovered the theft that recovered 20 acres of their land. A fitting resting place for a dog who had believed the universe revolved around him and who had been, on the evidence, largely correct. The drought years came and went. The border changed. More settlers, more farms, more fences cutting the grass into rectangles. The sky remained, the wind remained. The stools remained on the porch, occupied every evening by 2 people who had found each other through a registry listing and had built something that lasted. Merritt died in the spring of the 39th year. He was 69. He had worked the land for nearly 4 decades, and his body had earned its rest. The end was quiet. A morning in the house he had built, in the bed in the room where the south-facing windows caught the light, with Tindra beside him, because she had heard his breathing change in the night. She had heard it because she heard everything. She had spent 39 years listening to this house, and she knew what every sound meant. And when his breathing shifted at the 3rd bell of the morning, she knew what that meant, too. She was beside him when it stopped. She sat in her stool on the porch that evening and looked at the grass and thought about 39 years and what they contained, which was too much to summarize and too much to hold, and exactly the right amount. Going through his desk afterward, the heavy oak desk in the study where he had kept the farm's records and written his correspondence for nearly 40 years, she found, as people often find in the desks of people they have loved, things she did not know existed. A letter from his mother that he had kept for 30 years, his original territorial filing papers, carefully preserved, the property map with her measurements penciled in from the boundary stone incident. He had kept it, she realized, not as a legal document but as the first piece of evidence that she was going to be extraordinary, and a small notebook. It was leather-bound, worn at the corners, the pages soft from decades of handling. Inside, in Merritt's careful, unhurried handwriting, were sentences. Not his sentences, hers. Lines from her letters, copied out over many years. Not all of them, just the ones that had struck him. In casting, the most important thing is the ear. A house should sound right. The precision is what mattered, not the species. Adequate, with potential. She read them and heard herself from 25 and 30 years ago, and found that she had been more certain than she remembered, and more honest than she had credited. And at the bottom of the desk, in a small paper folder, a single sheet in his handwriting. It appeared to be a draft, heavily revised, crossed out, and rewritten of the last line of his registry listing. She could see that he had tried many versions before landing on the one that had been posted. The earlier versions were practical, informational, conventional. And then, in the final draft, in writing that was more deliberate, as if he had found what he wanted to say and was being careful to say it precisely. 2 stools on the porch. One is wider than the other because I built it for someone I haven't met yet. I would very much like someone to understand why. Below it, in different ink, a later edition, written sometime after she arrived. 2 lines she had never seen. She came. She sat in it. I was right about the stools. She fixed everything except the ring. She understood everything. Tindra held the paper for a long time. The border was quiet around her. The wind moved through the grass, the same wind that had been moving through this grass when Merritt filed on the land 40 years ago. The same wind that had been moving when she walked 3 days across the open plain with empty hands. The same wind that would continue moving long after both of them were gone. She folded the paper carefully. She put it in her pocket, the same pocket where she kept the temperature gauge she used at the foundry, because that was where important things went. Then she walked to the porch. The 2 stools were there. They had always been there. 39 years of weather and use had darkened the wood and smoothed the edges. But the joints were sound. The oak of the wide stool had not cracked. The ash of the narrow one had not split the iron brackets. The ones Merritt had made before Tindra arrived, rough and oversized. The work of a man who was not good at metalwork but who had wanted the stools to hold, were still solid. She sat in the wide stool. Her stool, the stool he had built for someone he hadn't met yet, with dimensions he had estimated from a chart, and a conviction that he would rather build too large than too small. She looked at the grass going on until it met the sky. She thought about a listing she had read in a casting shop 25 years ago, when the crucibles were cooling and the air smelled of quenched metal. She thought about a sentence that had made her read it 3 times. She thought about 5 months of letters and a ring that was flawed and a foundry that was not, and a man who had built 2 stools before he built the house because he knew what the point was and what was infrastructure. She had been right all those years ago to recognize the point and trust the infrastructure. The wind moved, the grass ran, the stool held. It had always held.